Hello and welcome to Westmapod, the Christie Time podcast about Agatha Christie's secret identity. I'm Mark Aldridge. I research and write about Agatha Christie a lot, including for my books about Marple and Poirot and the forthcoming The Swinging Christie's book, co-written with...
Me, I'm Gray Robert Brown, and I'm a writer and a Christie fan and a Westmacott fan, and this is episode 2, book 2, Unfinished Portrait. Hi.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm okay. I'm dry, which is good, as we're recording this during a storm.
So we're in Tenerife.
We are in Tenerife, Puerto de la Cruz.
And we recorded, you'll have already heard, dear listener, our other episode that we've recorded here, which was for the Swinging Christies. It's over on that feed. Echoes of the Disappearance.
Yes. But there is more to say about Tenerife than just that. So we knew there was something else that we wanted to cover while we were here, while we're soaking in the atmosphere.
So obviously you've been coming to the Tenerife Festival for several years now.
Yeah.
And this is my first time, excitingly. Had you been to Tenerife as a kid?
No, never, no.
On holiday or?
When we used to go to, a few places. If we had the money, we went to Portugal, to the Algarve. We went there 2 or 3 times. But the only time I'd been to Spain before I came to Tenerife was we went to Mallorca once, which is quite different to certainly the north part of Tenerife.
Do you know what? I have never been to Mallorca, but one of my best friends, friend of the podcast, Carla is from Mallorca, and I'm constantly saying she should invite me to go there, and she hasn't yet. But this is relevant because Carla was one of your students. Oh, Carla's the one that did your, I think, the MA?
Yeah, it might well have been.
Yeah, years ago, like before we knew each other. Yeah. So hi, Carla, if you're listening.
Yeah, hi, Carla.
It's not a spoiler to say up top that the whole kind of framing device of this book is set in... Well, it's not actually explicitly called out as Tenerife, is it?
No.
But it quite clearly is.
Yes, if you know that Agatha Christie's been to Tenerife and she's written this, then it clearly is. It's an unnamed island, which is referred to as Spanish as well.
Yeah, same in Man from the Sea, I think, isn't it? The Agatha short story.
I think you're right.
I think, again, she definitely says island. I think she says Spanish. I'm fairly certain she doesn't specify Tenerife.
Yeah, I think that there was something somewhere that was just like exotic. But yeah, clearly, I mean, we went to the Man from the Sea house the other day. We did. Literally, you know, the cypress-lined road or down to the sea were absolutely there. Oh,
indisputable, yeah. And indeed, it's a beautiful passage, or couple of passages, where Christie evokes Tenerife at the start and end of this book. And yeah, you don't have to walk far in this place to see views that feel very much like the views that she was looking at. It's why I pulled out a quote where she says, "I'm not going into details. This isn't a chronicle of such things. There's no need to describe the quaint little Spanish town or the meal we had together at her hotel," her being Celia, the main character, "or the way I had my luggage secretly conveyed from my hotel to the one she was staying at." And I thought, you know what I always think of is that description, or lack of description, in Chimneys, in The Secret of Chimneys, when she says, or the narrator says, well, I'm not going to describe Chimneys.
Because you can find it in the book.
You can look it up. Yes. And I sort of love that brazenness of going, there's no need to describe this. You know it. You can go visit. And Agatha, that's exactly what we've done.
Yes, we have, yes. Why go for the description when we could just hop on an EasyJet flight and find our way here?
And if EasyJet are listening and would like to sponsor future episodes of the podcast, then by all means.
Very welcome to. I just thought I'd flag up before we got into the book itself that when I came to the festival here a few years ago, I did put a little press cutting up, which Anna, who arranges the festival here, she absolutely loved and asked me to send it to her because it was an explicit reference to what she's been doing. So this is from the Manchester Guardian on the 28th of April 1927, and it says, "Detective stories are a favourite form of fiction, and the authors who reach the public through Messrs. Collins are noted for their skill. Mrs. Agatha Christie, for instance, has made Monsieur Poirot one of the famous detectives of the world. His fight against the Big Four is a thrilling story." So this is advertising the Big Four, which has just come out. "The publishers hope to receive Mrs. Christie's manuscript for her next novel, The Mystery of the Blue Train, very soon. Mrs. Christie has been recuperating in the Canary Islands after her recent illness." So that thing about having to like address it, the fact that everybody knows that she's had this breakdown or something has happened that's been huge in her life, and clearly there was a lot of publicity about it, but it's not ignoring it, but it's drawing a veil over it as well and saying she's getting better. And indeed that is why she came to the Canary Islands, that's why she came to Tenerife, was to recuperate and to do a little bit of work, but it was about recuperation, which, you know, in early 1927. So yeah, I just thought it was nice to give that bit of context. She didn't, as far as we know, write Unfinished Portrait here, and indeed she can't have really, because the autobiographical elements of the stories go later than 1927.
Yes.
But clearly it
is remembering it when she does come to write it. Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can imagine. I'm not surprised that Anna was thrilled to see the words Mrs. Christie and Canary Islands in the same sentence. It's like, yes, this is exactly what they've built this brilliant festival on. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah. Unfinished Portrait is the story of Celia, a woman who is staying on an unnamed Spanish island, where she meets a man called Larrabee, who is an artist. Larrabee realises that Celia is on the verge of suicide and implores her to tell him more about herself. Celia's story reveals a past of love, betrayal and fear, which have all led her to this point.
I think I asked you the other night, do you think this is the most popular Mary Westmacott?
Well, I think it's the most famous Mary Westmacott, but inspired by that, I had a look on Goodreads to see how they rated.
Interesting.
Now, these obviously are not our personal ratings, but there are thousands of people that have averaged out. And it's interesting to see that far and away the most ratings are given to, in terms of number of ratings, Absent in the Spring, which has over 15,000 ratings, and the rest are all under 5,000.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, so
That's
it's a big difference.
Oh, mind you, I think I might know why that is, but we will leave it for that episode.
Okay. So that also got the highest rating, the highest average rating of 4.14 stars.
Very good.
So that's at the top. And then the next one is Giant's Bread. Actually.
Which makes sense because, I mean, one of the things that Goodreads has done to sort of change reading habits is, or not change reading habits, reinforce perhaps, is, you know, you'll have that bracket and the number entry in a series, whereas before you would have to sort of scour the front of a book or a bookmark, like we've talked about before on various podcasts, and try and work out the order that something was published in, and maybe that was incomplete and all the rest of it. Nowadays, so many people will go to platforms like that and go, oh, that's the first one, so I'll start with that one. So I'm not surprised that Giant's Bread is read more than perhaps its reputation would belie, just because it's number one.
But it's also the second highest rated, so it's almost like sometimes the more ratings you have, actually your average can go down.
Well, and that's a compliment to Absent in the Spring as well.
Yes.
The fact that could quite easily have dragged down the numbers.
Exactly. So after Giant's Bread, the next one is A Daughter's a Daughter, number 3. These are all quite close together, by the way. And then it's The Burden, which I would have thought is generally thought to be the weakest, or one of the weakest. But we'll see. When we come to it, we may not feel the same. And then 5th of 6 is Unfinished Portrait, with Rose and Yew Tree at the bottom. Now, it's worth saying that Rose and Yew Tree's got 3.64 out of 5, so there's only a 0.5 difference between the lowest rated and the highest rated. But that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, so I would have said anecdotally that, well, there's a reason why I put this note down for us today, which is I was pretty sure that either Unfinished Portrait or Absent in the Spring would be the most popular of the Westmacotts.
Yeah, I didn't expect it to be Giant's Bread. I did know this is the most famous, which it also surprised me that it's not the most well-read, at least according to Goodreads.
Well, I think this is the most famous partly because the title has been co-opted by various other projects surrounding Christie. Yeah. So, for example, that Arena documentary, BBC.
Gorgeous documentary, yeah. Which is often on iPlayer, and if you can catch it, do. Yeah. Not only because it's the only place you can hear her audio interview with Snowden from the early 70s.
Oh, very good. Yeah, I mean, that takes the title Unfinished Portrait, which means when you're searching for any adaptations of this title, it's particularly nebulous and frustrating because that just keeps coming up and you're going, no, that's not an adaptation of Unfinished Portrait, that's just also called Unfinished Portrait. But also several chapters of I think biographies have taken it in the past. Yes. I know the 3rd episode of Lucy Worsley's Christie documentary was called Unfinished Portrait. So it's a title that's become very associated with Agatha.
Yeah.
Much like with the Swinging Christies, this isn't really about whether they're good books or not so much as what is interesting about them. So
Yes,
I think we'll
definitely,
save that conversation for something else, for another time, hint, hint. But I did think it was interesting to pull out that, so Max Mallowan, so Agatha's husband, who she marries between the publication of Giant's Bread and the publication of Unfinished Portrait. So in the narrative of Westmapod, we're introducing Max Mallowan now. And he, many years later, writes his memoirs, and he wrote in those that Unfinished Portrait is not one of her best, in his opinion, because exceptionally it is a blend of real people and events with imagination. Only the initiated can know how much actual history is contained therein. But, he says, in Celia we have more nearly than anywhere else a portrait of Agatha, and that's the quote you see recreated. I think it's on the cover.
I was going to say, I think this must be the only instance where someone's spouse has given the back cover quote for that.
Oh, no, not the only instance. Do you have any idea how incestuous publishing is? I think it happens all the time. But it is unusual for a quote from a 50-year-old memoir to be the Paul Press quote on.
But it's a good choice.
But it is a good choice.
I detect David Braun in that. That's such a good David Braun.
Quite possibly.
choice.
But it's interesting that, it is interesting though that the beginning of the quote is actually saying that the book's not her best.
That's not on the back of the book.
No. In terms of the context, our story starts in March 1934, which is when Unfinished Portrait was published. I was hoping to find a bit of a more accurate date. So I got in touch with our very good friend David Morris, who runs Collecting Christie. Basically, no. He sent me the ad from Collins that includes Unfinished Portrait. Also includes Orient Express, which is funny to see them on the same sheet. Because, of course, don't forget, as per last episode, that Christie's Mary Westmacott's identity, it's Agatha Christie. Spoiler, is a secret to the wider public at this point. So it's on their spring list with this March date, which is where we're getting March from. David says the earliest confirmed date available to buy is the 22nd of March 1934. So that's the closest we're going to get.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Thank you, David.
Yeah,
that's good. God,
I guess that'll do. Thanks, David.
If I find that someone bought one on the 21st of March, I shall be furious.
We'll riot. We will riot. But also, it's worth saying, I think, publication dates weren't quite as regimented.
No, definitely not.
As, they are today. So we know it was written in the early 30s.
Yes.
What was happening in Agatha's life around then?
Well, the most
Mark
significant
Aldridge.
thing is that she has remarried, and very happily remarried as well. So it's really lovely reading her letters from the early 1930s, where she is clearly so happy, especially when she's writing to Max. And it's just such a lovely difference from what we know had been such a difficult couple of years for her. And I think that Lucy Worsley makes a really good point, and I'm sure other people have as well, that there is a real sense of her working out her demons about that difficult period. We know that she underwent therapy, and as Lucy Worsley says, the book helped her to process a chunk of her life that now lay in the past. Her first marriage and its failure, her illness of 1926. She'd reached a new vantage point from which to look back, which is a really lovely way to phrase it, I think, that she has moved on, but hasn't quite been able to break with the difficulties that she had, or come to terms with the difficulties.
But is in the process of doing so.
But is in, yes.
Yeah. It's an interesting bookend for this trip for us to have recorded this Echoes of the Disappearance episode for Swinging Christie's, and now to be on to this, because it does feel like this is, reconciling a lot of demons that were raised by that incident, and that she was suffering through while she was here. Similarly, I did what we all must do at some point, which I know you've done in the past, which is bring your copy of The Mysterious Mr. Quinn to Tenerife, to Puerto de la Cruz, and read it. Well, I read it by the pool, but close enough. The Man from the Pool doesn't have quite the same ring to it. But The Man from the Sea, the short story in that, which she would have written around this time, it's interesting reading that back to back with talking about this book. There's something very raw and tragic and ruined and kind of devastated in that short story, which it does feel in Unfinished Portrait has started to be worked through, actually, if you put those two side by side.
Yes, yeah. Because Man from the Sea is 1929. So that's a really interesting, that's pre-Max. And then this is post-Max, and it might only be 5 years in publication terms between them. But nevertheless, that's a really significant 5 years for Agatha.
Yeah. And what else had she written and published around this time?
Well, there's Miss Marple, appearing in her first novel, Murder at the Vicarage in 1930. Poirot comes back for the first time since 1928 in Peril at End House in 1932. And then in 1934, there is this, Unfinished Portrait, as well as Why Didn't They Ask Evans, and you mentioned Murder on the Orient Express. Plus, that year, there's also short story collections, The Littledale Mystery and Parker Pine Investigate, which... they weren't written that year, but nevertheless, it's a huge variety. And she's done other stuff as well. I just picked out some highlights from the early 30s there. But she's a busy bee at this point, which I think speaks to her happiness. And I think that's, people talk about the 1930s being perhaps her critical peak or her commercial peak. And we obviously don't necessarily agree with that as a sweeping statement. But there's no denying that her most famous titles are in this era, and that she really seems to pick up this sort of pace almost, not just in terms of how much she's writing, but the sort of adoration of her work, the anticipation for a new Agatha Christie.
The demand.
Yeah.
We're just going to touch on a few kind of contextual points that are pertinent to the book. So obviously we're in the interwar period. The First World War concluded in 1918, and the Second World War will have risen up by the end of this decade, 39. So there's a great period of uncertainty for a lot of people. There's the gradual rise of fascism, which, lest we forget, that's not just a thing that's happening in Germany. You've Oswald Mosley and a fascist riot in Birmingham this year in 1934. So it's very much a going concern in the UK as well, unfortunately. And in terms of the kind of literary landscape, Tender as the Night, the F. Scott Fitzgerald book, which is very much about recovering from a breakdown on the English Riviera, which, I don't have to explain any further how similar that sounds. It's a great book, actually, but it's very, I don't know, if Christie was an American bloke, then Tender as the Night is what would have come out instead of Unfinished Portrait, arguably. And the first Ngaio Marsh novel, the first Roderick Allen novel, who's her detective, was published this year as well. And Alice Liddell dies, which I thought was significant because there are a few allusions to Alice in Wonderland in this book. There are a few allusions to Alice in Wonderland throughout Christie's career, actually. She clearly, knew the story well. But Alice Liddell, I should say, is the real life Alice that character was based on.
Because in terms of thinking about how this sits within, chronology of Agatha's life and where she's written other books, I think we both were thinking it's roughly the same period span as Giant's Bread, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. We're going to come on to more kind of similarities between this and Giant's Bread as the first two Westmacotts. But yeah, I mean, that book is set around 1890 when Agatha was born, but also when Vernon Dare is born, to about 1930. And it seems a similar span here, doesn't it? We've said several times, many people have said about how Agatha's not always particularly hot on facts, and there's dates in particular, and that may account for the fact that there are slightly, although this is a very biographical novel, it doesn't stick fully to her chronology.
Everything's just slightly off from Agatha.
Yeah,
it feels like a really deliberate choice to add or take away years, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's 10 years between the disappearance and the epilogue, which is a much widening of the chronology that we see in Christie's real life. Celia's dad dies when she's 10 and Christie was 11, just turned 11, by 2 months. So yeah, there's a few, which could be to differentiate her from Celia, or it could be, like we say, Christie not being great with the facts. But nevertheless, it's clearly what we would now call autofiction.
the book structure and its appearance on bookshelves, there are a few interesting points. We mentioned the title.
It's a clever double meaning of. I mean, it's a beautiful title. I think we can agree. But it also occurred to me that it's a clever double meaning of a title because it means both literally artwork in progress, which is how you understand it for the majority of the book, but also because Celia is considering ending her life. And by the end of the book, it becomes apparent that she is not going to do that she will live on. The portrait is unfinished because she will live on. And actually that changes the meaning of the title from something a bit negative, like, oh, you're just an unfinished portrait, you're not there yet, to your life's not over. And it actually becomes quite positive and quite euphoric.
Yeah. It's such a good title, yeah.
The first edition cover, we talked about Giant's Bread first edition cover last episode because it's this modernist classic, which I think would get more attention if it was a cover for a quote-unquote standard Christie. This first edition cover is interesting because it's one of the few times, and I think I'm getting this from Collecting Christie again, it's one of the few times that the first edition in both the UK and the US use the same cover. So designed by Hookway Cowles. And the only other examples are The Mysterious Fairy Stars,
yes,
the first Agatha, and then Star Over Bethlehem, which is one of our swinging texts.
Yes. But I think the cover for this, which is sort of, it's almost a bit romantic, I think it's okay. I don't know whether it quite speaks to the like almost intellectualism of the book. It makes it seem a little bit more straightforward than I think actually
I would agree
is.
with that, yeah.
So the structure itself has got two framing devices, isn't it? Which is a bit unusual.
It is unusual, and it surprised me when going back to it. I think I said in our introduction episode, this is only the second time that I've gone through the Westmacott for this project, and I hadn't really remembered that. I'd remembered one, but I was kind of surprised by the second. So we've got the foreword, which is from the perspective of Larrabee, this painter, to My Dear Mary, who, of course, is Mary Westmacott, aka the writer.
Yes.
So here we have to address the thorny issue of. So I mean, this whole project of ours is intent on asking the question, who is Mary Westmacott? Well, the answer turns out is a character in a book. She is literally a character in this book.
That's funny. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that. That's a great point.
Well, and there's a lot going on there, right? Because Christie has invented her, because she is a character. She is an alter ego. Mm-hmm. And then you get book one, and then you go into the which is essentially a prologue. Actually, I think I would probably have renamed it and then had. I don't know. It is, for me, it's like forward prologue, the bulk of the book, and then a return to the prologue, so an epilogue. But it's called book one, book two, book three. I'll allow it, Agatha. So then that's quote unquote Mary Westmacott retelling the end of the Celia narrative, which is her on Tenerife, in Puerto de la Cruz, considering suicide. Book one's called The Island, and did you notice opens with a poem? Mm-hmm. Interestingly, so there's a poem in The Road of Dreams, Agatha Christie poetry collection, called An Island.
Yes.
Which is very similar, but not the same poem.
Yes.
I wondered if that was intentional or if we had any insight into that.
I wish we did. It's such a shame that there is so little archival material about the Westmacotts. That's why we went to America, remember? That's one of the reasons we went there, is that I wanted to dig out what they had about Westmacotts in some of our publishers' archives. But no, other than we do know that there are other poems that she did tweak over time and she did revise slightly. Okay. Yeah, so when they came out in the 70s, they were slightly different, a couple of them, from what they had been. So it wasn't too unusual. We know that she's like so many of us. Agatha loved to just keep tinkering. It was never perhaps quite right. I always wanted to make it that little bit better.
Well, and funnily enough, so these days, to get The Road of Dreams, you buy a copy of Star Over Bethlehem, which has The Road of Dreams attached to it at the back, right?
Yeah.
And in Star Over Bethlehem, there is a short story called The Island. Yes. Also not the same as An Island or The Island. But I wanted to pull out a biblical allusion in this poem, which is, it's quite similar to Mark chapter 6, verse 31, which is Jesus speaking to his disciples. And he says, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." We know, of course, Christie was very religious. That's what Star Over Bethlehem is all about. So that allusion will absolutely be deliberate. And there again, you know, there is an interesting parallel reading to be drawn between Celia's spiritualism and Agatha's. And you almost get I think I talked about this in Giant's Bread, you almost get what's so fascinating about the way she structures these Mary Westmacott novels is I feel like they're quite self-consciously structured in a way that you feel like she's coming up to a new section, a new chapter, a new part, and she almost passes the baton to the new subject in a way that feels very literary, that feels very skillful. You know, so the end of this book, when Larrabee is looking at Celia, he says, I saw in that moment a child. She had gone back deliberately to a childish world, finding their refuge from the world's cruelty. And indeed, that's what we're then going to do.
Well, I was just thinking while you were saying about it, how much I agree that they feel very deliberately structured in a way that perhaps not all of the Agatha Christie mysteries are. But this is the same time, roughly, as when Three Heck Tragedy comes out. So 1935 is Three Heck Tragedy, or 34 in America, I think. So they're actually the same year in America, where that is a very deliberate structure. And I wonder if one came first. I mean, obviously, Three-Act Tragedy is structured in 3 acts because it's theatrical. But I wonder whether there is a bit of interrelation.
Yeah, maybe
in the writing.
I guess the difference between I'm not saying that Agatha Christie doesn't meticulously structure her books as well, and that only Mary Westmacott does. If I can pull the id and the ego apart like that, but I guess the difference is that there's something textual. You know, like that example where Larrabee is almost calling out to the reader the fact that the subject matter is about to move on to Bill Dunsrum, and we're going back to Celia's childhood in a way that the structure of the mystery novels is more about the mechanics of the case. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. Yes,
like a textual thing.
It
rather
draws
than a structural
attention
thing.
to it.
So book two
then is the start of Celia's story from childhood. So that's something we're going to talk about in a moment. But that's where we might find a lot of autobiographical type elements of where Celia's life seems to have an awful lot in common with what happened to Agatha.
And follows her from, not quite birth, but
very
childhood.
Early. Yes.
To chronologically to adulthood before we then go...
Yes. In more detail than we might expect, usually from a book, actually, that's talking about someone's life. And then we go to book 3, which actually returns to where we were in book 1, doesn't it?
Yeah, back to Tenerife and breaks the chronology, because actually then there's well, we'll get onto that with the twist.
I'd noted, I wondered what your thoughts were about the fact that in book 2, a couple of times we have a comment by J.L., as in Larrabee, where he sort of adds his own thoughts at the end of a chapter. I wasn't really particularly enamoured of this. I understood it, but it almost felt like Agatha was trying to over-explain things or over-egg the pudding a bit when those bits were coming in. And I felt that I didn't necessarily need him, and it sort of pulled me out of the action slightly. What were your thoughts?
I didn't mind it. I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think it is an author going just to remind you the framing device, just to kind of keep that in your mind. Quote unquote, he says things like, it's interesting to see how completely her brother drops out of Celia's narrative. And, you know, it is literally flagging up, you know, this is the device I've used here linguistically. And the same with these people have, after all, become my creations. It's, that's such a metatextual comment on the very act of writing. I mean, we're not a million miles away from Christie publishing the ABC murders, which is what it reminded me of. I won't say any more in case we spoil, but those little changes in perspective. And it kind of suggests that there's a layer of, can we fully rely on, can we fully trust everything we're being told in the narrative, which by the end will become very relevant. So I think an interesting device. Your mileage probably varies as to whether it's intrusive or not, but it's only a couple of times, I think, isn't it, in book 2?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and I think that's why it was such a shock. Actually, when you see it, you
there should
go,
have been a couple
there we
more."
go. Yes, we're coming out a little bit.
So, as we said, it's undeniable that a great deal of Unfinished Portrait is autobiographical. I think we still have to be careful about drawing too much of a line, too explicit a line between certain thoughts and feelings and certain events, where it's obvious that these parallels can be drawn, i.e. Christie herself has cropped up, for example, in her autobiography and said, this is genuinely what happened, then I think it's fair enough. But what I don't want to do, which I think can be reductive, is to just, I don't mean in Christie scholarship specifically, I think people do this across the board, which is just to go, oh, well, that's like biographical, almost dismissively, as if to say there's no skill in reconveying it or remixing it or weaving it into a narrative.
Yes.
Because, I mean, that's what a lot of writing is.
Yes. But some of these things you just go, oh yes, no, that's definitely an Agatha experience. The gunman, I think, is the most obvious and pertinent, because it's not only that it's autobiographical, because she tells the same story in her autobiography about this nightmarish figure of the gunman, who we'll explain more about in a moment, but it also adds a sort of tension and mystery. It means that we are trying to work out, well, who is this gunman in Celia's subconscious in this book. Yeah,
it becomes the sole driver of the plot because ultimately she comes to associate Dermot with the gunman,
yes,
who is her husband, who we'll come on to speak about later, and is at least in part based on Archie Christie. But you can see, almost like obfuscation and almost like the cluing of a detective story, you can see various avenues for the shadows in Celia's life. Like, is this where we're going with that metaphor? Is this, is this going to be the thing that comes to trouble her? So yeah, it's evoked in a literary way very interestingly.
Yeah, and it's such a distinctive story that we know Agatha was obviously really significant to Agatha, that I read it and thought, well, anybody who knew Agatha Christie is going to recognise this story as being definitely her, rather, written by her. So Mary Westmacott's cover would be blown quite quickly, I think. If any of her family were to read
Do you
this.
think because she hadn't really spoken about it publicly before Unfinished Portrait,
publicly,
that she would have got away with it? Yeah,
yes,
I know you're saying people that know her closely, but as in there are a few other similar passages. So say Unfinished Portrait had first been written anonymously in the 60s, the other period we talk about, that would have been more likely to blow her cover publicly.
Yes. I guess I was just thinking it shows that she was actually perhaps more relaxed now, because I suppose that she knew that at least one or two close people to her knew about it.
Maybe there's an argument to say that more of Giant's Bread is fictionalized because she felt like she had to maintain the anonymity more with that novel.
Oh, that's interesting. But like the other way around, like she had the freedom to use real stuff more because she was less worried.
Like she'd got away with it. Yes. Only a couple of people knew.
Yes.
So the first time she tells the story of this terrible nightmare in Unfinished Portrait.
Yes, so the one terrible dream, the gunman with his powdered hair and his blue and red uniform and his gun. And most horrible of all, where his hands came out of his sleeves. There were no hands, only stumps. Whenever he came into a dream, you woke up screaming. It was the safest thing to do. And there you were, safe in your bed, and Nanny in her bed next to you, and everything all right. There was no special reason why the gunman should be so frightening. It wasn't that he might shoot you. His gun was a symbol, not a direct menace. No, it was something about his face, his hard, intensely blue eyes, the sheer malignity of the look he gave you. What I love about this is that Agatha is deconstructing her own dreams. Like, she's giving like literary analysis almost of a story that's come to her in her dreams, that she knows it's not about the gun. It's about the surprise of somebody suddenly being a threat. The
possibility.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I find so fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I say, lest we say there's no artistry there and it's all just directly drawn from the autobiography, I actually put this next to the section in Agatha's autobiography written many years later. And in that, she says... She describes him as French, which she does not say in Unfinished Portrait. She says his uniform is grey-blue, and in this it's blue and red. So there are definitely elements that she's sort of fictionalized. But in the autobiography, exactly like in Unfinished Portrait, there is a later section where she says... the dream has changed, the dream has evolved, and now it's scary in a different way.
Yeah, so in Unfinished Portrait, we're told that it got somehow more frightening. The dream would start well, it would be a happy dream, a picnic or a party, and suddenly, just when you were having lots of fun, a queer feelings crept over you. Something was wrong somewhere. What was it? Why, of course, the gunman was there. But he wasn't himself. One of the guests was the gunman. And the awful part of it was... he might be anybody. You looked at them. Everyone was gay, laughing and talking. And then suddenly you knew. It might be Mummy or Daddy or Nanny, someone you were just talking to. You looked up in Mummy's face. Of course it was Mummy. And then you saw the light, steely blue eyes. And from the sleeve of Mummy's dress, oh, horror, that horrible stump. It wasn't Mummy, it was the gunman. And you woke screaming. Celia would say desperately to herself in the dark night, Mummy isn't the gunman. She isn't, I know she isn't, she's Mummy. But in the night, with the shadows and the dreams still clinging round you, it was difficult to be sure of anything. So that is such a psychological take on the horror of someone, you know, that thing of like betrayal or death or something that is coming out of a person you know isn't the person you think they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about this a little bit in our Giant Spread episode, but this is a time when psychoanalytical approaches to fiction were increasing because psychoanalysis was on sort of cultural radar in a bigger way.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, she is almost therapizing herself whilst Larrabee is also therapizing Celia, who is a stand-in for her. You know,
yes.
It's layers within layers.
There are layers, yes.
Idea of the gunman having a stump instead of a hand is uniquely invented for Unfinished Portrait and for Celia's narrative. It isn't mentioned in the autobiography, and that makes a lot of sense given the twist, right? So it transpires at the end that, well, it's open to interpretation, actually. The way I read it was that Larrabee reminded her of the gunman of her nightmares because it transpires, only has one hand. And there's a whole thing about her not seeing his hands and him being this incredible genius because he doesn't have the full dexterity that some painters might have.
Yes. I was thinking about that. I think a lot of it is that she comes to like Larrabee and then realises that he's got that personification, that physical description of what the gunman is, and then that helps to...
That cures her.
Yeah.
See, I read it quite a bit more negatively than that, because I thought the way that the last few paragraphs are written, it's really ramping up the tension, and it's like she's fine. It's like she's put to bed her fears, and then it's like someone's gone, but your nightmare's real because he's here.
Yes.
But that's the genius of the ending. Is
I
that
think
it
that's
could be
great.
read either way.
Either of those.
And also the fact that he holds back the detail about what really happened from the beginning, from book 1 until book 3. So there's a moment, except for the one incident I referred to at the beginning of the story, he kind of admits later on, and there's an encounter where she sees his disability, and it's like omitting a crucial piece of info from, you know, Roger Ackroyd or something like that in the narrative of that. It could. There's a really fruitful, unreliable narrator reading there. Yeah,
she left a story in her video.
It is very ambiguous and elliptical. Actually, it's funny. There was a review I read, I think contemporaneous review, that had a go at how many ellipses she uses.
Do you know, I was just looking at that thinking, God, Grace cut a lot out of this bit.
No.
And then I realised that it was from original.
But I mean, again, I don't want to get on my soapbox again, but if these books were thought of as literary, then you would consider punctuation like that as a clever device rather than something that's sort of cheap.
So we have several important characters in this book who are drawn from real life. So we have Cyril, for example, brother, who is very much like Monty, Agatha's brother. We have Dermot being very much like Archie, we think. Archie, of course, being Agatha's first husband. And then Judy and Rosalind, of course, Agatha and Archie's daughter. Miriam is Clarissa, so Agatha's mother. And then Granny, of course, Auntie Granny as well there. So the way that they're described, I don't think that it's a huge leap to say that about any of them, that they are sort of symbols for these people that really existed in Agatha's life.
Yeah, now Granny being similar to Agatha's Auntie Granny is interesting because Auntie Granny is sometimes flagged up as an inspiration for Miss Marple, right? So we're told, so Granny lived at Wimbledon and Celia liked staying with her very much. I think we hear about Ealing cronies in inspiring Miss Marple. Auntie Granny and her Ealing cronies, which is a bit north of Wimbledon, but it's the same side of London, so we'll allow it.
Does sound like the title of a new spin-off murder mystery series.
It does.
Auntie Granny and her Wimbledon cronies.
The features of Granny's house were, first, the garden, a square pocket handkerchief of green bordered with rose trees, every tree of which Celia knew intimately. You know, there's these really detailed and evocative descriptions that you feel like... I can't say for sure, but you feel like are drawn from life. I'm sure that the sort of quirks of Granny are taken from Auntie Granny or similar.
Yes.
Things like her belief that you should always have a £5 note handy. And I loved the detail that you must never give a cheque for £9 because it's too easy to alter 9 to 90.
Well, that's true, because you just have to write the TY at the end of the 9.
Well, that's why you write only. And then, why am I saying that in present tense? Nobody writes cheques anymore, so it doesn't matter. But I do remember asking my mum, why do you always write only? Like, it sounds like you're being like skimpy. And she was like, you know. But yeah, and as you pointed out at the beginning, Miss Marple is particularly at the forefront of Christie's mind at this time, because not only does she make her debut around the time of Christie's trip to Puerto de la Cruz, but she's made her full-length novel debut a couple of years before that, around the time that Christie's writing Unfinished Portrait. The character of Peter, the one who got away.
Yes.
Do we know who that's a likeness for?
Well,
or is he an amalgamation?
I
of a
think
few
an amalgamation,
suitors?
yeah, because there are stories told, very similar stories told in the autobiography. She has that thing about that she broke off Agatha, that is, broke off an engagement over letter, which is that the same thing she does with Peter?
It is, yeah.
Yes. So that's what I think. But I suspect that also was not unique to Agatha, especially in sort of wartime, or when things were happening, that you might be separated for quite a while.
Yes.
And then you meet somebody else.
Yeah, I think there was quite a lot of that. Interestingly, I know you're not a Downton fan. I'm not particularly either. But there's a bit where she's going to be cajoled into a partnership with an elderly suitor who's very sweet but not right. Yes. And that's beat for beat a storyline that Lady Edith goes through in Downton Abbey.
Oh, is it?
Peter's quite a tragic figure, and he is the one who got away, and he's an interesting character, I think. My heart broke when there's a bit where he says he's very kind about her breaking off the engagement and ultimately ending up with Dermot. But he says, oh, well, I guess that's my fatal habit of putting things off. He says, we're like that. That's why as a family, we always miss the bus.
Oh, that's really sad.
Isn't it?
Yes.
But yeah, and even I couldn't help but notice though, Peter is this sort of loyal and lovely, beloved figure. She gives him the same name as her dog.
Yes.
And indeed, he then dies in 1935, and then the year later, as in the dog dies, and then the year later she publishes Dumb Witness.
Yes.
With the dog that is based on Peter, although she renames him for that book.
Yes, Bob.
Bob, yeah. Yeah, I don't know if that it's maybe not too flattering to be named after a dog. I don't know, but then she did love her dogs.
Yes, very much.
Maybe. We've talked a little bit about Celia's character as distinct from Agatha and Mary Westmacott, and a little bit about the kind of psychoanalysis approach. You pointed out that she has an insatiable curiosity about words and the sense of her being kind of introverted.
Yes, I felt there was quite a lot in it that was about her internalizing, especially when she's younger, a lot of her worries and concerns and not being able to express them at the same point that she's brilliant at reading and writing. And so I thought that was quite a telling about the comparisons between both Celia and Agatha, who both struggled with that Agatha struggled with being able to be completely honest sometimes, or say when she was unhappy, or express the reasons for her unhappiness, because I'd have loved to have seen what Agatha Christie would have been like if she'd lived 100 years later and she didn't feel so formalised by society. Because it feels like that is so often the cause of her anxiety. That, I don't want to upset people, or girls shouldn't do this, or this sort of thing. And I wonder about how much happier she might have been if she lived in a society, at least in her childhood, that would allow her to express herself and not be told this is what you do and what you don't do.
Yeah, I mean, other textual examples, most of her world was in Celia's world, was inside her head. The outside world did not excite her curiosity. It really is a book that embodies, the whole point of the book is that it goes deep into Celia's psyche. There is potentially a reading that Celia is neurodiverse even.
Yeah.
There's a point where she doesn't quite get that her nanny is joking, which I thought was interesting. And if it was in a book written today, you would go, oh, there's an autistic reading to be made here.
Yes, yeah. And also there's a theme of nobody really understanding her, but her perhaps not even always understanding other people, like feeling just slightly out of the joke. Like everyone seems to understand things in a way that's slightly different from the way that Celia sees the world. I was saying about, how much she was stressed. Celia seems to be stressed by not wanting to upset people. So, for example, there is her friendship with Margaret when she's a child, who's got a lisp. Celia very much enjoys spending time with, but is really tortured by the fact that she can't always understand everything that Margaret is saying and can't see a solution to that, so ends up just being terribly upset by it rather than trying to find a way or to communicate to a parent that, I do like Margaret, but sometimes it's a bit more difficult for me because of this. But she seems very happy in her own world, Celia, just as Agatha had to be because she didn't go to school famously. But apparently Celia liked the nice, warm, comforting darkness when she's offered a light at night. The darkness was friendly. So that thing about not needing that reassurance of things like light or people being there, but that actually she quite enjoys being in her own little world, and that perhaps the darkness allows her to sink into that even more. And then I think one of the things that's really clear parallel we can draw between Celia and Agatha is the horror of selling the home, because we know how much Agatha was horrified by the idea of selling Ashfield and tortured by it into the 1960s, as we know, that we've discussed her ideas about possibly buying it before it was demolished. And I think that this really is about how much Celia and perhaps Agatha craved stability, that what they really want is to know that their life is going to be okay. There's also this story, this traumatic story of a gardener who's found hanging in the stable, which is a version of something that happened in Agatha's life as well.
What's interesting, I think, is that she links it directly to, so there's the incident with what happens with the gardener, and then a new section starts basically straight after that, and it begins with Celia's father died when she was 10 years old, and we go straight to Celia's father's death. And there's clearly, like you say, there's clearly something about the darkness encroaching on a young Celia, and by extension a young Agatha's otherwise innocent life. And I think that's a moment that is pulled out by Max in his memoirs as well.
As something that he noted felt very much like Agatha.
And just the way that she talks about Celia's dad's death is quite interesting, and maybe supports the neurodivergent reading that we were talking about, actually, which is things like she's not necessarily internalizing the mourning, but she's looking at the adult's mourning and sort of thinking about the clothes that she's wearing and, whether she needs to copy that behavior and stuff like that. That kind of the real naivety that you get from the early stages of a Bildungsroman, which is why it's such a fascinating mode to write in, and why she returns to that, having just done it in Giant's Bread. And we'll come on to this, but there are so many similarities there. There is a fictionalized account of Agatha's real life disappearance in 1926. And if you want to hear more about this, you can check out our episode on Echoes of the Disappearance, which we dropped on the Swinging Christie's feed end of last year. But it feels like all the pieces are kind of being set in motion, doesn't it? You've got Dermot gets a car, you've got Miriam's health ailing, Dermot suddenly talking about this woman he's met called Marjorie, and anyone that knows Agatha's story as we do goes, oh, I see how, we're going towards this bit now. And Miriam, Celia's mother, who is a little suspicious, I think it's fair to say, of Dermot initially.
Yes.
Then, before she dies, actually turns around and says, oh, I didn't trust him then, but I feel now that when I go, I'm leaving you with someone who will look after you. Oh. Which, again, is so tragic. And it's the dramatic irony of, us with the knowledge of Agatha's story now in the modern day reading this and going, oh, God, there's trouble ahead.
Yes.
And Celia's, in the same way that Celia's dad leaving her after the gardener hangs himself, Dermot and Judy feeling like strangers to her, and her mum dying has the same effect within the plot. These things happening in clusters has the same effect, which is that it makes her feel isolated. It makes her feel, to quote, the bottom had fallen out of Celia's world. How cold the world was without her mother is one quote. And the narrative style starts to fracture more. It gets more elliptical as her world starts to break down. So you have that direct link between the style and what's actually happening. And, you get things like she's laughing hysterically and the room goes black and whirls around her. So the account of the actual night, as refracted through Celia's story and as fictionalised into Celia's story, she wakes up in the middle of the night just desperate to find her mother. She dressed and put on a coat and hat. She took her mother's photograph. She would go to the police station and ask them to trace her mother. Her mother had disappeared, but the police would find her. So she's clearly, not thinking straight. We know that her mother has died.
Yeah, she's confused.
Oh, the police station. Yes, the police station. Where was the police station? Surely in a town, not out in the open country. She turned and walked in the other direction. The police would be kind and helpful. She would give them her mother's name. What was her mother's name? Odd, she couldn't remember. What was her own name? Again, clear parallels here. How frightening. She couldn't remember. Sybil, wasn't it? Or Yvonne? How awful not to be able to remember. She must remember her own name. You can't see because this is a podcast, but in the quote that I've pulled out, there's so many dashes where it's new line, ellipses, new line. It's really fragmented and broken up. She stumbled over a ditch. The ditch was full of water. You could drown yourself in water. It would be better to drown yourself than to hang yourself. Again, links back to what Celia witnessed as a very young girl. If you lay down in the water, Oh, how cold it was. She couldn't. No, she couldn't. She would find her mother. Her mother would put everything right. She would say, I nearly drowned myself in a ditch. And her mother would say, that would have been very silly, darling. Silly. Yes, silly. Dermot had thought her silly long ago. He had said so, and his face had reminded her of something. Of course, of the gunman. She must go home. She must hide. The gunman was looking for her. Dermot was stalking her down. Ellipses. New line. She got home at last. It was 2:00. The house was asleep. Actually, I'm sort of misremembering, because in a way the disappearance is refracted over a couple of passages rather than there being one parallel, because she goes home and goes to sleep, but there's a later passage which ends book 2, which could also be seen as a parallel for the disappearance, which is an actual suicide attempt of Celia's, isn't it? So she walks to the river. Long ago there had been a river through a valley and primroses. Long ago, before anything had happened, she had walked rapidly. She came now to the point where the road crossed over the bridge. The river, running swiftly, ran beneath it. There was no one about. She wondered where Peter Maitland was. He was married. He'd married after the war. Peter would have been kind. She would have been happy with Peter, happy and safe. But she would never have loved him as she loved Dermot. Dermot, so cruel. The whole world was cruel, really, cruel and treacherous. The river was better. She climbed up on the parapet and jumped. And that's the end of book 2. And it's only in recollections at the start of book 3 that we hear about her being pulled out of the river and the police accosting her for a suicide attempt, which was, of course, illegal.
Yes.
And then the story is filled in from there. But yeah, really, really moving, awful passages, but really beautifully written, and can offer an insight into Agatha's psyche.
So we were saying that there's quite a lot of elements in this book that feel autobiographical. Any other sort of little moments that you, like little Easter eggs that refer to other Agatha Christie's? I know I spotted a few. What did you spot?
It's just things like, I don't know, there's this like polite, slightly busybody Belgian lady referred to at one moment. You just immediately go Belgian, ding, 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 you know? And
like that is a little clue for everyone to go, Belgian? Haven't I read about a Belgian once?
Well, I'm not saying that that's what Agatha's doing, but it's just fun when you're an Agatha Christie fan that you hear those references, and you know, a tail caught in a mousetrap.
Oh, nice.
Point. There's a cousin Lottie, not Letty.
No.
There's a wooden rocking horse of Judy's, which put me in mind of Poston of Fate.
Yeah.
So fairly early on, well, about a third of the way through, there's a chapter called Mother and Daughter. Mm-hmm. My Mary Westmacott, my Westmafan head, make it happen, immediately went to A Daughter's a Daughter, which is a Mary Westmacott novel coming up, something to look forward to.
Yes.
But there are several times when the complicated dynamics between parent and child and the capacity for ill feeling and maybe in a way that isn't talked about in traditional family dynamics, but especially when a family has gone through difficult times, and just the kind of grit there, just the kind of capacities for complications within those relationships. There were quite a few instances of that I felt in this, which felt very much like the sort of emotion, the sort of subject matter that Christie then extrapolates out and makes a novel out of, and a play, A Daughter's a Daughter. So at one point she says Dermot and Judy had suddenly become friends, you know, which is a slightly strange way of referring to a father and their daughter, though still deploring Judy's well-covered frame. We'll go on to the many sins of Dermot, but they talk to each other seriously like grown-up people. When they romped together, Judy nearly always got damaged.
Damaged is an interesting word.
Yeah, isn't it? But like they're all fragile.
Yeah.
And there's a bluster and a boisterousness and a capacity for tension and difficulty that isn't that's what I mean. It's not the way you would normally talk about a nuclear family, a mum, a dad and a daughter, which I think is very much what Daughter's a Daughter feels like to me.
But damaged is also like, it's a possession. like rather than a human.
Yeah, that's very true.
Damage, yes.
Yeah. Judy she'd fancied was sometimes jealous of her, meaning Celia. She says later, she liked her father's attention to be entirely focused on herself. And then later, possibly the saddest bit, the hardest bit, is after the kind of crisis point at the end of book 2, when, and ultimately Celia and Dermot have split. Judy says to Celia, "It was you Daddy didn't like. He was fond of me." And then shortly after, Celia says, "I don't know whether I failed with Judy or succeeded." All of this is incredibly ahead of its time.
Yes.
Brutal in its honesty way of depicting family life.
Really brutal, painful. I found it really almost intrusive to read it, which I guess is why we've got it as a Westmacott rather than as a Christie. But it felt like, I was really getting an insight into the psychology there and all of the thoughts processes of everyone, really.
Yeah, definitely. I would be interested when we come on to A Daughter's a Daughter in a few episodes' time, how those parallels shake out. Because it's a different narrative, but I do think one of Mary Westmacott's strengths, if I can put it that way, is showing those really quite potential for quite unpleasant dynamics between mother-daughter, father-daughter, stepfather-daughter, etc.
Also, our old friends, the Army and Navy stores, pop up, which is, I feel like I talk about Army and Navy stores all the time when talking about Agatha Christie now. But we get a reference to Granny going to the Army and Navy stores, definitely something that we can recognise, both from Christie's fiction and Miss Marple at Bertram's Hotel, and also autobiography.
Which is relevant because, of course, if Granny is the stand-in for Auntie Granny, and Auntie Granny is one of the inspirations for Miss Marple, and then you have it in a Miss Marple novel at Bertram's Hotel, but also by the time Agatha is Marple-ish age and writing her autobiography, she's then calling back to I've run out of breath, but you get the point. But yeah, we're told the stores were packed, apparently with old ladies all carrying off hams in four-wheeled cabs. And there are similar...
really bad actors being ushered into four-wheeled cabs.
Yeah.
I don't actually got ham. Come on, Terence, you'll do.
Kate Garraway. That's a Traitors reference, by the way, but it will probably be dreadfully outdated by the time
Yes, it will.
In several works, Christie refers to the remembering mauve irises on her nursery wall, and in Unfinished Portrait we'll have that with Celia twisting around a pillar. Sleeping Murder is the one that springs to mind, and I think she references it.
Oh, there's a few. Blue Geranium.
Yeah.
There are several, yes.
But interestingly, this does have some overlaps with Sleeping Murder as well, just given that thing of the echo of a house that you've remembered but forgotten. There's a psychoanalytical reading there about confronting the trauma of the past and remembering the past, which is very much of a piece with Unfinished Portrait.
And my ears pricked up, or my eyes widened. I mentioned Hazel.
Yes, mine too.
Because, one of my many Agatha Christie obsessions is Witch Hazel, which is an unpublished story, which has got a medium in it called Hazel, sometimes with a Z, sometimes with an S, depending on which version of the story you're reading. But basically, it outlines the Witch Hazel story here.
Yeah.
So there are two different versions of Witch Hazel, and I don't want to say too much because obviously it's unpublished and I don't have permission, but it's fair to say that whether Hazel is a real medium or not, that is whether she really has psychic powers, that's resolved in different ways in different versions of the story. But one of them, I'm not spoiling anything because Agatha's written and published it herself here as Mary Westmacott, and this version of the story is basically a summary of one of the ones that Agatha wrote. Yeah,
it goes into quite a lot of detail about this story that Celia, quote unquote Celia, has conjured up. Hazel is essentially an adult imaginary friend.
Yes.
It starts out as such, and then she realises that maybe she's a conduit, an outlet for her creativity, which, interestingly, is what we're coming on to. Themes,
art and artistry, which is so foregrounded in this that I thought it was really interesting because it reminded me a lot of Agatha Christie's early short stories that are often about someone being called to something, whether it is a person or whether it is a profession, and here artistry, which again is a theme, along with music, that you see in a lot of her early stories in particular.
You mean as a calling, not... I thought you meant like, come over here.
Yeah, as a calling, as a like that. It's innate in you. That's what I felt was really interesting.
Poirot, come to the crime scene, please.
Yeah, like you can't resist it. Like, you're a writer, great. You know, you're going to know that might not make your fortune. Oh, maybe it will. But if you'd gone into banking or something, because it's a calling, it's not always the sensible choice. It's something you really want to do and you're driven by. Same with me, with the stuff that I do.
Yes, I think you're right, absolutely. And again, it's very apparent in Giant's Bread as well.
Yeah, well, it takes this, what we might call a holistic view of Celia's life. It's thinking about everything together, how all of her experiences and her desires and her feelings all work together.
And have made her the person that's in Tenerife in that moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is a really sophisticated way to write about a person, to not just be like, oh, it was this one event, it's this one thing that led her to this despair that she has, but it's a lot of things. In book one, there's a quote that says that Larrabee tried getting her on a canvas on this new unfamiliar medium, words, because of course Larrabee is an artist. Strung together words, no brushes, no tubes of colour, none of the dear old familiar stuff. Portrait in 4 dimensions, because in your craft, Mary, there's time as well as space. And I loved sort of reading that, going, oh, we've got a bit sci-fi as well, time and space, whenever I hear that. So this idea that the universe sort of drawing you to something in a way, I just thought that was a really lovely and interesting theme that runs throughout this book.
Again, it feels almost anachronistic. It feels quite modern to take that approach to, autofiction is such a huge business now. This is, it's not a million miles away from the sort of thing that someone like Virginia Woolf was doing, which is very highfalutin and not a writer that people put in parallel to Christie regularly. But yeah, I would say there's something about, there's so much about filling in the detail of the portrait, to use the book's metaphor, that is maybe not, and the book is very deliberate in that. What are the things one remembers in life, is a quote, not the so-called important things, no, little things, trivialities, staying persistent in the memory, not to be shaken off. Can I confess, I'm not a huge fan of epistolary novels, because I feel like I would rather the writer, as this narrative, quote-unquote God, filtered what I experience of the narrative a bit more stringently than, I know they are anyway, but a bit more stringently than what two people are writing to each other in letters, plausibly speaking within the narrative of the piece.
Yes.
Dare I say, that is a slight gripe of mine in a book like this, which is like there were so many extraneous details, particularly in the first half, and I felt like actually the book really only kicked into gear properly at the point at which the war came crashing in, and when you hurtled towards the Dermot plotline. It is very, very much the intention of the book. It's just maybe not the best readerly experience, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it would be easy, given that Christie is by this point a successful writer, and I guess Mary Westmacott is too. I mean, she published one book that was very good, and here's another that's, coming out into the world. It would be easy maybe to make Celia a brilliant artist too, but she isn't. Is she? In fact, there's a lack of artistry in a way. Like there's a bit where the nanny says to Celia early on that she's got no imagination, but you can't have everything. And there's an irony that Celia is terrible at painting, because of course the painting an accurate portrait of someone is the very subject matter of the book. And then of course she's not quite cut out for the life of a musician either, which is very much what happens.
That sounds familiar, yeah.
Exactly what happens in Agatha's life. And then when her luck starts to change, and maybe there's an element of, because Agatha is quite self-deprecating about her skill as an artist or a literary figure. Maybe she's kind of using that, and that's why Celia is not God's gift to creativity. She is just a nice workaday kind of person. But when she comes back from this event, and she's basically like, oh, I'm not stupid after all. Like I spoke to clever people and I held my own and I did really well. And that's the point where she is cut down by Dermot. He basically takes the wind out of her sails and says, oh, you were talking and laughing and you were quite unlike yourself. I do rather hate it when you sound silly. I don't like silly women, which is just one example of many awful things that he says to her that we'll get onto. But I thought it was interesting that in that we're then pitting Dermot in direct competition with Celia's creative endeavours, and well, we know which one wins out.
Yes.
And indeed, after that, when Celia is developing what we know to be witch hazel and exercising her creativity for the first time, she speaks to this publisher who says, you're not a heaven-sent genius. I don't think you'll ever write a masterpiece, but what you certainly are is a born storyteller. They, meaning the public, want fiction, which is plausible untruth. And again, it's so deeply biographical, but also, I mean, plausible untruth. That you could put that as a pull quote on Unfinished Portraits cover, couldn't you? I mean, that's another way of saying autofiction.
Yes. And this does very much reflect the way that Agatha felt about her writing, although I don't think we would agree.
No.
About, you're a good storyteller, but you'll never write a masterpiece. And because she was so self-deprecating, that was the sort of thing that she was expressing as well.
I was surprised, actually, I don't know if you agree, by how many parallels between this and Giant's Bread I found going through it, because actually the first time I read them, they felt quite different. Giant's Bread felt like she was still very much finding her voice, and then Unfinished Portrait felt closer to, for example, Absent in the Spring and A Daughter's a Daughter. But actually, if in Giant's Bread it's music, then in Unfinished Portrait it's painting. They are two sides of the same coin. Straight from the beginning, the way that she talks about Larrabee being a genius with his pictures stacked in his studio is so similar, I think, to some of the descriptions of Vernon ultimately and Sebastian Levin in Giant's Bread. Larrabee says, I should like to be God and know the truth, but a novelist can be God to the creatures he creates. There's so much, we talked about it last episode, but there's so much in this, especially the early part of Giant's Bread, about Vernon, Mr. Green, the imaginary friend, God, sort of the poles of Vernon's life and how he navigates meaning as he's growing up. And all of that is in evidence in Celia's childhood as well. And I also noticed there's a whole section where we go to Paris, which of course is biographical as well. But in a way, I mean, Vernon didn't. So in a way, some of Unfinished Portrait feels a little bit like it's the aspects of her biography that she didn't give to Vernon. It's I'll give them to Celia.
Yes.
There is also some repetition though. And I would say, it's funny, again, I did feel like some of it felt very repetitious. The early kind of childhood to adolescence sections of Giant's Bread. Maybe reading them back to back didn't help, but I don't know. I did really like Giant's Bread, so I did feel a little.
I think there's that thing that they are tonally very different, or I feel that they are, in that there's something a bit, warm is not quite right, but there's something, I guess, more personal about Unfinished Portrait, that it feels more welcoming as a story in a way, whereas Giant's Bread is setting up more complex relationships in terms of our main protagonist, but because we've only really got Celia and a bit of Larrabee in this,
that's true.
That feels quite different.
It's interesting you say that, because I made a character list for Giant's Bread when I was doing the notes for that episode, and I shortly before recording this realised I hadn't for this. And actually, once you put down the characters that we've already listed, which are the kind of parallel characters like Cyril from Monty, etc., there aren't a whole lot other significant characters. I mean, you have friends coming in and out, and there's actually a tiny bit which didn't make my notes where they talk about Peter, Agatha and two friends being like a foursome, and I was like, that's a whole section in Giant's Bread, is that like four young things, two couples going about town, stepping out, and it's just a mention here because you're right, in this it's just about Celia. We're really honing in,
but also that speaks to you saying that it's sort of a bit of the story in this, and then and the rest of it in
Yeah.
Giant's Bread, because we've had the stepping out stuff, so therefore we don't need it in here.
Yeah, this is more, that section in this is more focused on Peter, building up Peter, and then Peter comes crashing down and she straight away meets Dermot, and the narrative takes that jolt turn.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier about how Celia struggles to express herself when things happen that she perhaps finds distressing. And one of those examples is when the butterfly is pinned to her hat. And I thought that was a really nice example. The way she can express herself is that she can write about it, and other people might be able to draw it, but that Celia can't really communicate it verbally because she finds it so difficult to do, or she did certainly as a child.
Yeah.
I just thought that was a nice example of
Definitely.
that,
So
really.
this it takes place at the summit of the mountain in the Alps, and she's already been a bit scathing about the Alps, which I thought was hilarious. When she's a bit like, oh, it's just a zigzag in the sky. What else is new? And then the guide skewers a butterfly to Celia's hat as an act of kindness to go, because Celia's admiring how beautiful it is, but Celia hates it because for her, it's not, the beauty is not about pinning it down and giving it to her and her owning it.
Yeah.
It's such a neat metaphor. It's not an original metaphor by any stretch of the imagination, but it really works as a little vignette in the story.
Yes. So we come to Dermot.
God, do we have to?
Well, when we first put these notes together and I put his name down, I described him with one word, which I won't repeat because I don't think we want an explicit tag when we put this episode out. But you can probably guess a similar word, at least, for how I would describe Dermot.
So, I mean, he's an abuser, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And it's really, it does make for quite difficult reading. It's also brilliantly written, as in she really understands what makes him tick. I mean, I guess you would, having been up close to... And we like I said, there's a problem in drawing parallels, especially when none of these people are alive to kind of testify for themselves, and we don't wish to kind of trial by fiction. But it's indisputable that Dermot is in some ways based on Archie Christie, Agatha's first husband, and it's highly probable that many of the things that she depicts Dermot saying and doing to Celia have precedence in real life, right?
Yes.
I thought it was interesting. This reference might terribly date this podcast because we're recording it, peek behind the curtain, dear listener, a few months before it goes out. But have you listened to the new Lily Allen album?
No.
It's incredible. It really is worth a listen. It's essentially autofiction in and of itself.
Yes, I've read lots about it, or seen lots about it.
The lyrics are phenomenal, but oh my God, it's fascinating. So it's basically about, for those who don't know, the whole album is about her husband's various misdemeanors, violating the terms that she felt they'd agreed through their open marriage, etc. There's a whole song called Tennis, which is about he basically cheats on her with a woman that he says he's playing tennis with. Substitute that for golf. The whole thing about who is Madeline, all of that, you could easily sub out Marjorie, as she's called in this, or Nancy Neal, as she was called in real life. I couldn't help but draw those parallels. And but it's funny, isn't it? Golf does symbolise now to me, sorry, any golfers listening, it does symbolise to me that like opportunity for the man to kind of go away and do you know what I mean?
And escape,
that's exactly,
and not have to, I'm doing golf, I've got golf.
Yeah,
today.
and Agatha clearly felt the same, because there's all sorts of, I don't know, Lynx was written before that, wasn't it? But like having a corpse on the golf course in retrospect, you go, I don't know, there's something fascinating there around the time.
And Sunningdale Mystery and stuff like
that. Yeah. Anyway, give it a listen. It is brilliant. But the songs Tennis and Madeline in particular for unfinished portrait readers. I did also wonder, we talked about this a little bit with Jan Carson in our Belfast episode. Dermot is a very Celtic name, like specifically Celtic name.
That's true.
And we did talk in that episode of the Swinging Christies about, there's an argument to say that there's a bit of a Christie's attitudes towards Ireland and Irish people aren't always too hot.
Yes.
I just wondered if there's some unconscious
anti-Celtic
bias.
Yes.
But yeah, anyway. But Dermot is never explicitly called Irish or said that he has Irish heritage or anything like that. And as far as I know, Archie Christie didn't have any.
I didn't believe so, not so I know.
But yes, I kind of mentioned it before, but Peter leaves the narrative. 3 weeks later, Peter sailed. New paragraph. A year and 3 months later, Celia married Dermot. And it's a name we've barely heard at that point in the story, only in the framing device, I think. It comes almost completely out of the blue. It's quite a jolt, which is obviously supposed to evoke the jolt that she feels with him entering her life and how much of a burden in her life he's going to become.
Yeah.
The next chapter is named after him, and then it begins with the line, Peter came gradually into Celia's life, Dermot came with a rush. And you just know you're in for something awful.
It's a great bit, that thing though about that suddenly we're told that she's going to marry Dermot. I just think that was so good. That makes you want to keep reading.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I mean with, I feel like that's the point where the book starts to really pick up pace.
Yes, because there is this thing of, because it's so autobiographical, that I do read it and think I enjoy it because I know it's by Agatha Christie, but I suspect other people would have read it and gone, well, why do I want to know about
where is this going?
And where's it going? Why should I care?
You could imagine contemporary readers certainly.
Which I think is one of the big problems with it, that it's great for us and it's obviously was therapeutic for Agatha, but whether it works in its own right as a novel, I'm not so sure. But I'm really pleased we've got it. But perhaps that explains the Goodreads rating.
Maybe. But interestingly, it's the same thing we say about Endless Night on the Swinging Christies, which is, if you don't really know the context or any plot spoilers, then what do you think that story is about? Certainly if you'd never, imagine, but if you'd never heard of Agatha Christie, i.e. didn't know that she wrote books where bodies are likely to turn up, then reading that you'd go, where is this going? Until a certain point.
So Dermot changes. So again, I guess like the gunman, but as we eventually learn. But even before that,
there's a few times where Dermot approaches reminding her of the gunman, but not quite.
Yes.
And it's only at the end that she takes you there. But you can see an astute reader would be going, it's like, he started to remind me of something, but I couldn't quite think of it. Almost like she doesn't want to make that connection, but we're making that connection as readers.
Yes. Because when Dermot's in the war, we're told that he's a different Dermot, very jerky and flippant with haunted eyes. And so this perhaps is alluding to trauma from the war that might influence how he goes on. Because the haunted eyes, that's a shell shock symptom.
Yeah. So, I think there is a reading. I'm not talking about Archie Christie. I am just talking about Dermot because I don't know enough about Archie in real life to say this. But there is a reading that Dermot comes back from the war changed, and that's where the abuse starts.
Yes.
Because of the way that she rushes through and the way that he enters her life with a rush, and then the war happens quite quickly afterwards. You don't see what he's like before that in the quote-unquote honeymoon period. So you can't really substantiate that reading, but it's possible.
Yeah, because this is such a whirlwind at the beginning, but then we're told that Dermot was not demonstrative. He never said, I love you, hardly ever attempted a spontaneous caress, which when you tally it up with other things, like when he says to Celia,
this is awful.
This is the worst. Well, I was about to say it's the worst bit. There's other terrible bits as well. But it says, Celia, promise me you'll always be beautiful. And then Celia says, you'd love me just the same if I weren't. And he says, no, not quite. It wouldn't be quite the same.
Yeah.
Which is, I felt almost sick reading that. That was so vile.
Yeah, well, and then when she gets pregnant, it ramps up a gear, the same sort of psychological abuse ramps up a gear, because it now becomes about her body changing and she won't be beautiful anymore, but also this weird jealousy about the baby. This is what I was alluding to with the same undertones of toxicity that you can detect in A Daughter's a Daughter. But yeah, at one point he says, I don't want a baby. You'll think of it all the time and not me. Women do. They're forever being domestic and messing about with a baby. They forget about their husbands altogether. She says, I shan't. I shall love the baby because it's your baby. Don't you understand? It's because it's your baby that it's exciting. And then tears in his eyes, he says, you might even die. She says, I shan't die, I'm frightfully strong. Obviously, a lot of women did die in childbirth at this time. And this is something that he seems to be really concerned about, that she's going to die in childbirth, and something that he's preemptively resenting the child for. And he imagines the doctor saying to him, we can't save both the mother and the child, which is a hell of a thing to tell her that he's imagining. And then he says that he said in the dream, hack the child in pieces. And knowing Christie's staunch Christianity, I can't help but detect a bit of story of King Solomon there.
Judgment of Solomon,
which I only know because of Doctor Who Time and the Rani.
I was just thinking the same thing.
That's literally the only reason I know that.
We know more than JNT knew when Pip and Jane came and told him the story.
Oh, what?
Because that's it, because they said, everyone knows the Judgment of Solomon.
But more people know about Einstein.
Yeah, that's true.
And they'll see him shuffling into a little cell. Well, now we know.
So Celia says that she wants a boy just like you, which just made me go, no, you don't. You really don't. But Dermot anyway tells her that I shall beat him. To which she responds, how horrid you are. Yes, that's correct.
I mean, Celia comes out of these passages really well. It's funny, I think one of the things that because of course a lot of parents did beat their children then, I think one of the things I was pleasantly surprised with reading Unfinished Portrait is Celia isn't just, in the hands of a lesser writer, she could be a bit wet or just a bit absent, because it's hard to depict yourself refracted through fiction. And when you've got a character like Dermot there who's clearly awful, it would be very easy to depict Celia as just kind of a bit vanilla, but actually she does bite back at him about things.
Yes, she does. Yes.
And rightly so.
So even while Celia's in labour, she's thinking about Dermot.
Yeah, well, kind of woozily. It's like almost a hallucination.
Yeah. And we're told that Dermot was very funny with Judy. He was afraid of her. When Celia tried to make him hold her in his arms, he backed away nervously. So before I go on to the next thing he says, I wonder if this is Agatha or Celia trying to set up the fact that, he didn't want her, but then he fell in love, they end up being best friends, and so isn't it a funny story in a way? You know, no matter how much he didn't want her, actually they end up being best of friends. But that's not actually a good thing. Like, it's very, very troubling regardless, but I suspect that is the message that's trying to come across. But another terrible thing that Dermot says is how Judy is so awfully fat now. Yeah,
there are a couple of comments about that he makes about
me she'll be thin,
girls' appearances, which are really awful. Again, I don't want to keep sort of banging the same drum, but I do think that there are elements of this novel that wouldn't feel out of place in a novel published today. And one of those is Dermot is your classic, almost, it feels like a very 20th century stereotype to me, but obviously it isn't. But Dermot is a classic stereotype of a man so he comes home from work in the city, he doesn't want to talk, he sometimes it says he has headaches, sometimes he says he has indigestion, he's clearly not a very good dad. All he wants to do is go and play golf. You know, like all of these, they're almost cliches now, but they weren't when Christie was writing.
And then we get the full horror from Celia's perspective, that she's been, I imagine, suppressing or ignoring
the signs.
Yeah. Because we're told that she basically has a countdown for when Dermot is able to come back home.
Which is awful as well, because she's really looking forward to seeing him, even though and again, it's this dramatic irony, we know where this is going as Christie fans, but even as just regular readers, we know how awfully it is. We can see it, but she can't see it yet, or like you say, she's not willing to see it yet.
Yeah. So when he does arrive, we're told that something was wrong. Dermot had come, but it wasn't Dermot. It was a stranger who looked at her. Quick sideways glances and looked away again. Something was the matter. He was ill, in trouble. No, it was different from that. He was a stranger.
And again, you do have this is hinting that he's the gunman, but it's not until later that she finally explicitly says that.
Yeah.
And I think holding that off for the reader, I mean, that's a really sophisticated device as well, because it would have been really easy just to make that parallel really explicit really early on. And if Christie was the sort of unsophisticated writer that some people think she is, she would have done that. It's time for our if you liked this Try That section, Dr. Mark Aldridge.
Yes, which you're so much better at than me. Because you read so much more contemporary fiction that isn't just gay men or crime, which is most of what I read.
I think it's interesting because this came out of because we spend so much time talking about tracking the similarities and differences with other Christies. It's interesting to kind of broaden that field, right? I've already given away one of mine, which is Tender as the Night, which is I'm definitely going to reread with knowing that F. Scott Fitzgerald is a close contemporary of Christie and Westmacott, again with fresh eyes. Hot Milk, which was made into a film recently with Fiona Shaw. It's a brilliant book by Deborah Levy, and it's all about a mother and daughter in Spain, basically having a kind of recuperation trip and their toxic relationship in the sun. I won't go into full details as to the things that it reminds me of. I could say it again in a couple of weeks' time for A Daughter's a Daughter, actually. The passage where Celia, which we didn't really get a chance to talk about, but the passage where Celia flirts with Catholicism, and some of the kind of meta stuff and the literary kind of doubling that's going on through this made me think of Muriel Sparks' first novel, The Comforters, which is both very, very much about Sparks' own Catholic conversion and has quite a thick layer of fiction as a device. And I think you had a similar sort of genre-based
yes, well,
comparison.
it just struck me that knowing that Agatha was such a fan of Dickens, that Dickens, of course, several times did do this thing of telling people's life stories. And so things like David Copperfield and stuff, I thought for me, frankly, it would be quite interesting to go back and reread them or read some of the ones I haven't read. I'm afraid I haven't read the entire Dickens canon.
Wait, what?
I know. In fact, probably only 4 or 5 of them.
I did a Dickens module at uni, and they gave us extra weeks for certain novels which they just never did on the course.
But because
Bleak House, I don't know if we did. Dombey and Son we got an extra week for. Because you just can't read. I mean, you can read Great Expectations in a week, but you cannot read Dombey and Son in a week. But anyway.
Yeah, so I just thought it'd be interesting to see what there is from those sort of life story type novels.
So yeah, on the basis of this book now, so we've read 2 Mary Westmacotts for this project now. What kind of image are we conjuring at this point? Has our perception changed of Mary Westmacott after having read Giant's Bread to having read this one? What do you think?
I think so. I think it's developed. I mean, for me, the big thing is that emotional intelligence that underpins all of her understanding of characters. I think that is really
just the level of detail about it. Which is funny, isn't it? Because detail in a crime novel is often about obfuscating the truth. Here's a saturation of information, so the crucial piece of information might go unnoticed. And the same is not true here. The detail is all about building up that portrait, painting that portrait. And that's very much something that's in evidence in Giant's Bread and this. It's funny, isn't it? We've talked about this, but they're always called her romance novels, and people have spent many years debunking that because it's a ridiculous label and it's reductive and it's probably misogynistic. But I mean, far from being her romances, they're her music novels. You know, there's something about artistry in all of them, and there's that passage about Celia learning piano and wanting to be a musician and ultimately falling short of that feels like one of the most evocative of the whole book. And obviously that was the whole subject matter of Giant's Bread. And also we'll come on to it with Yew-Tree. I think I mentioned it last episode, but the specifics of the way there's a strong element of nature writing running through these books, and particularly the way she evokes breeds of trees and she talks about particular flowers and stuff. We've seen it in Puerto de la Cruz. It's a beautiful landscape. You'd be remiss to not observe the blossoms and talk about the trees.
Yes.
do read along with us.
Yes,
please. 2 weeks from today, we'll be dropping the episode on the third book, Absent in the Spring.
Yes, very easy to read. That
it's
very
shorter,
tough,
isn't it?
Yeah, very tough to read in multiple parts. Actually, I'd say, if anything, like, because you get so into it and it's so intense.
Yes.
That actually, I think if you've got an afternoon or something that you can put aside, I would say it's a one sitting sort of a book if you can.
Well, and read it like she wrote it, because as we'll talk about next time, she wrote it very quickly, possibly the quickest of any of her books. But yes, each episode drops every other Tuesday. Do let us know your thoughts. Please send us pictures of the copies that you're reading. We'd like to see,
especially international editions. We'd love to see.
Definitely. As we said before, we'll do a mailbag on our wrap-up episode, on our reflections episode, in a little while after we finish the series. So do write in and let us know your thoughts, and we'll mop all that up then. Hashtag Westmafan.
You're gonna make it happen.
It already has.
It's gonna be a thing.
Already has. Do pre-order the Swinging Christie's book if you haven't already. And please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And make sure you stay subscribed both to this Westmapod feed and to the Swinging Christie's feed, because there will be more episodes every month.
Yes. And do get in touch. You can find us on Instagram at Christie_time. You can find us on Blue Sky at christietime.bsky.social. Email us at christietimepod@gmail.com, and you can see our website at christietime.com. Gray's website is grayrobbertbrown.wixsite.com/grayrobbertbrown. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Mark Aldridge, and on Blue Sky at markaldridge.info, which is also my website address. And of course, you're always very welcome to, alongside your pre-order for the Swinging Christie's, why not put my Marple or Poirot book in your basket at the same time, eh? Go on, treat yourself.
Do. Westma bye.
Westma bye. You looked at me really expectantly, and I'd forgotten.
Well, I mean, I think that wasn't part of the plan, and I really didn't want that to be, but I actually can't think of another way to sign off. I resisted keep swinging for some time as well, but the public want what the public want, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. Westmapod is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded in Puerto de la Cruz on the 13th of November 2025. Our artwork is designed by Tom Double, and our music is by Dar Golan. Loads of my laptop's died.
Oh no.
Let me get me charger.
I feel I should say something really funny that you'll find when you're doing the edits, but my humour has deserted me today. What could be funny? I have to say that Jane MacDonald at Hoopla is an amazing coup, so well done them.